Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to Nutrition 101. Today, we are going to finish up our discussion of the micronutrients by bringing around our discussion to blood health and immunity. We're going to touch on the remaining minerals that are necessary for proper body functioning. And we're going to talk about some of the other vitamins and nutrients that are involved in immunity and blood health. And we're going to talk about how the immune system functions, and that will be it. I'm also going to be posting a lecture next week, probably on Monday or Tuesday, about energy balance, which will be the information that you will need to start your diet project, which I will also post at the same time, and I will discuss in the course of that lecture. There will be a quiz on bone and blood health. There will be a quiz on energy balance. There will be a quiz on pregnancy and birth. And then there will be a quiz on life cycles, as well as the final exam. I'll be posting those today and then next week. And then the following 2 weeks after break. And then the final exam and the final project will both be due at the end of classes, which I believe is sometime in the third week of December. So just to get right on to our discussion here, this shows a picture of a bone, and we talked last time about the minerals involved in bone structure and the functions of bones. One of those functions I mentioned was that the bone marrow, which exists at the core of the bone, produces blood cells, which are necessary for making blood. So the red blood cells are made in the bone marrow, and those carry oxygen to our tissues. And then there are also white blood cells, which function as our immune system. And there are a number of different types of white blood cells that have different functions. There are 5 shown here, but we're not going to talk about all of them in this class. We're really just going to talk about B cells, T cells, and macrophages, which we'll talk about next. And then we have platelets as well in the blood, which get made in the bone marrow. And platelets are the primary factor that causes our blood to clot and allows us to form scabs and heal wounds. So the first nutrient is iron. And iron comes in 2 types. There's heme iron and non-heme iron. So heme iron is iron 2+, and non-heme iron is iron 3+, and it has to do with how they bind to the hemoglobin protein and also how they bind to oxygen. So iron is part of hemoglobin, which carries oxygen to our tissues. It's also part of myoglobin, which is the protein in our muscles that binds to oxygen, which helps in muscle contraction. And then iron is also involved in the electron transport system of mitochondria. It can donate or receive an electron from copper, as well as being part of the enzyme catalase. It's recommended that you get 10 milligrams a day of iron if you're a man, and 15 milligrams a day if you're a woman between 19 and 50 years of age, after which your iron needs go down to the same amount as men. The extra iron is necessary for women because of menstruation, the production of blood and tissue, and then the loss of that blood and tissue can cause iron status to deplete. There are a number of factors that affect how you get iron. So only about 10 to 15% of the iron that you consume in your food actually makes it into your body, and the vast majority of it is non-heme iron. Although you get some heme iron if you consume animal products. There are also other things like MFP, which is a protein factor that's present in meat that assists iron absorption. And then there's also vitamin C, which assists iron absorption. If you have deficiencies of protein, this can affect your ability to transport and store iron. And if you have a deficiency in copper, or if you have problems with things like your spleen, it can be more difficult for your body to recycle iron. However, if you have a properly functioning metabolism, then a lot of the iron that you consume will be recycled. Now, I mentioned heme versus non-heme iron. So if you have a diet high in MFP factor, vitamin C, citric acid, lactic acid, and if you have enough acid in your stomach and you consume sugars, those all enhance iron absorption. If you consume your iron with a lot of fiber or phytates or calcium and phosphorus, there's something called EDTA, which is a food additive that helps prevent or helps cause coagulation and filtration. And there's tannic acid, which is present in many fruit skins and teas, as well as other polyphenols, which we talked about being sugar alcohols that are that can cause gastrointestinal distress, but can also be treated as soluble fiber depending on the context. This is why it's more difficult to absorb iron from vegetables and fruits, because they contain a lot of phytates and fibers as well as decent amounts of calcium most of the time. And this is a picture of hemoglobin and myoglobin. Myoglobin is really just a quarter of a hemoglobin protein. It's slightly structurally different, but hemoglobin has 4 iron binding sites on it, and myoglobin has 1, and both of those iron binding sites are what we refer to as heme, which is just a chemical moiety that is good at binding iron and presenting it to the universe so that it can bind to oxygen in a very specific way. You don't need to know the structure of this. It's just handy to at least be able to zoom in on the microscopic level once or twice. So iron deficiency can be caused by bleeding as well as by poor absorption, which is why menstruation can cause iron deficiency. You can assess whether or not you are iron deficient from a blood test, and some people, if you go to give blood, they'll test your blood for iron, and if you are low in iron, they won't even allow you to give blood. We call this deficiency anemia, and it has many various and displeasurable symptoms, such as blue sclera of the eyes, reduced resistance to infection, reduced work productivity, reduced tolerance to work, reduced physical fitness, weakness, fatigue, impaired cognitive function in children, reduced learning ability, increased distractibility, impaired visual discrimination, impaired reactivity and coordination in infants, itching, pale nail beds, eye membranes and palm creases, concave nails, impaired wound healing, reduced resistance to cold, inability to regulate body temperature, and pica. And there are 3 stages of iron deficiency. The first one is called iron depletion, which is where you don't get enough iron or you lose a lot of iron. This decreases your iron stores, which in turn decreases the amount of the protein ferritin in your blood, which is the transport protein for iron. You don't generally experience any physical symptoms at this stage because your body is working to mitigate that. However, stage 2, you develop something called iron deficiency erythropoiesis. This is characterized by decreased iron transport, reduced transferrin, which is one of the proteins involved in absorbing iron, reduced production of heme, which is the molecule responsible for binding iron, and you start to experience some of the physical symptoms such as reduced work capacity. Now, stage 3 is what we call full-blown iron deficiency anemia. This results in decreased production of normal red blood cells and the reduced production of heme, which both lead to the inadequate hemoglobin in your blood, which leads to low oxygen transport. And this can cause pale skin, fatigue, reduced work performance, impaired immune function, and impaired cognitive function. People who are deficient also tend to experience reduced toleration of cold. And this is a picture, a micrograph of two sets of blood cells. The top one is anemic blood cells, and the bottom one is healthy blood cells. The healthy blood cells are bonded to iron, and the unhealthy ones are not. The healthy ones have iron and therefore are bonded to oxygen, which gives them their color. Now, you can also become toxic in iron if you supplement too heavily, or if you have an iron contamination source in your home or in a water source. This can cause infections, lethargy, joint disease, skin pigmentation, loss of hair, death by heavy metal poisoning in children, as well as organ damage, enlarged liver, amenorrhea, and impotence. Amenorrhea is the cessation of menstruation. When you experience iron overload, this is called hemochromatosis, and it's usually caused by some genetic order that enhances our iron absorption, but it can also be caused by repeated blood transfusions, massive doses of supplements, and several other rare metabolic disorders. Incidentally, it can also be caused by alcoholism. And the symptoms of toxicity, as you probably already guessed, are similar to those of iron deficiency, but the main difference is that iron toxicity can cause tissue damage. We get heme and non-heme iron from red meat, fish, poultry, shellfish, eggs, legumes, dried fruit, and fortified grains. And iron deficiency is a big problem in the developing world, but it's also a fairly large issue in the developed world. And this chart shows that. So in worldwide, children under 5 years of age in developing countries have a 51% incidence of iron deficiency. And in developed countries, that is a 12% incidence, which is still enormous. Specifically in the United States, most of those percentages hover around 10%. So children 1 to 2 years have a 9% incidence. Pregnant women have a 12% incidence. Women 16 to 19 have 11%. Females 20 to 49 have 11%. Men 12 to 49 years of age typically don't experience iron deficiency, probably to do with the fact that they don't menstruate. And men typically consume more meat than women do in our society. Now, I mentioned that you get heme iron only from animal foods, specifically animal flesh, but sometimes eggs. These animal products contain a mixture of heme and non-heme iron, and all of the iron in plant foods comes in the form of non-heme iron. So on average, our daily intake is maybe 10 to 20% heme iron, and then the rest of it will be non-heme iron, which isn't the biggest issue in the world because our body has ways of chemically transforming non-heme iron into heme iron. It just takes energy. Now, one of the simplest ways to increase the amount of iron in your diet is by cooking in an iron skillet. So it might seem crude, but honestly, it works. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. This is one of the main reasons that cast iron cookware is still so popular, especially in homesteading and farming households, because it's not economically practical to consume large quantities of meat being the highest energy consuming and most expensive food that you can cultivate. So being able to increase the amount of iron in all of your food is of benefit. The next nutrient relevant to blood health is zinc. You've probably seen zinc on multivitamin supplements, and it might not be clear how it's involved because you don't really hear about it in most nutritional discussions due to the fact that it has sort of a subtle effect on our body. It's very important because it's part of many enzymes, which, if you recall, an enzyme is a molecule that causes chemical reactions necessary for our body functioning to happen more easily. It's also associated with the hormone insulin, which is involved in regulating our sugar consumption. It's also involved in making genetic material and proteins because those enzymes that it's a part of synthesize DNA and other proteins. It's also involved in the immune system because those enzymes help develop immune responses and produce white blood cells. It's involved in vitamin A transport, taste perception, because it's involved in sensing, chemical sensing in your sensory systems, like your taste system. It's also involved in wound healing and the making of sperm and the normal development of a fetus. So it has a sexual health component as well. Now, zinc interacts with iron and copper and competes for transport proteins such as transferrin and binding proteins in the GI tract. And so it's best to avoid consuming zinc with either of those two metals if possible. However, it can be difficult because zinc is found in protein-containing foods, which highlights the importance of diversifying your protein consumption to maximize the diversity of micronutrients present, because you can't typically absorb large doses of any of these nutrients at once. You need about 15 milligrams a day if you're a man and 12 milligrams a day if you're a woman. And the protein sources that you can find it in are meats, fish, poultry, whole grains, and vegetables. Now, a zinc deficiency can have a lot of diverse and horrifying effects on your body, like high ammonia, which is likely the result of digesting amino acids to make sugar. You have something called low alkaline phosphatase, which is a type of another enzyme that zinc is involved in producing. You can have low insulin, growth retardation, abnormal collagen synthesis. Collagen is another protein that's essential for proper rebuilding of our tissues. Slow DNA synthesis, since zinc is involved in DNA synthesis. Impaired cell division and protein synthesis. Weak sense of smell. Poor sensitivity to taste of salt. Weight loss. Delayed glucose absorption. Diarrhea. Nausea. Impaired folate absorption. Night blindness. Delayed onset of puberty. Small gonads in males. Decreased synthesis and release of testosterone. Abnormal glucose tolerance. Reduced synthesis of adrenocortical hormones. There's many of the things like adrenaline that are responsible for our metabolic rate. Altered thyroid function, which is also involved in our metabolism. Altered skin test responses. Low white blood cell count. Few antibody forming cells, so depletion of the immune system. Thymus atrophy. Susceptibility to infection. Enlargement of liver. Anorexia. Mental lethargy. Irritability. Impaired reproductive function, which is something observed in rats. Low sperm counts, generalized hair loss, lesions, rough, dry appearance, slow healing of wounds and burns. So if you are experiencing any of these effects, you may not know it, but it'd be a really good idea to check your zinc consumption, because you might be able to avoid some serious health complications by merely adjusting your nutritional state. Now, on the converse, you can also experience toxicity of zinc if you overconsume it, and this can lead to anemia because it impairs your iron absorption. It can also reduce the amount of hemoglobin that you produce, as well as a growth in length but without normal zinc content of the bones, raised LDL cholesterol, lowered HDL, diarrhea, vomiting, decreased calcium and copper absorption, fever, elevated white blood cell count, which is similar to leukemia, renal failure, muscle pain and incorporation, heart muscle degeneration, exhaustion, dizziness, drowsiness, and reproductive failure. So a lot of these are generalized symptoms of heavy metal poisoning, but because zinc is involved in so many proteins, having too much of it can actually overproduce those proteins, which can have just as bad of an effect as not having them. And this is a picture of some zinc-containing foods. There's a crab there. There's some oysters, some chicken wings. There's some ham and A big one is chickpeas. Chickpeas have a large amount of zinc. Now, copper is one we've been mentioning a lot, but without really talking about it too much. It is necessary for the absorption and use of iron and the formation of hemoglobin. It's involved in the conversion of non-heme to heme iron. It's also part of a number of enzymes. You need about 1.5 to 3 milligrams a day. And deficiency symptoms lead to anemia and bone abnormalities. However, deficiency of copper is rare in humans because it is readily available from our environment. Toxicity of copper can lead to vomiting, diarrhea. That's just general heavy metal poisoning. And then you can get it from seafood, nuts, grains, seeds, and legumes, similar to zinc. Now, we've talked about iodine once in this class, but it's a very important regulatory mineral because it is involved in the production of two thyroid hormones that help regulate growth, development, and metabolic rate. You only need about 150 micrograms per day, which is easily obtainable if you consume iodized salt, which is one of the reasons that salt has iodine added to it because it was found that landlocked areas with no exposure to the sea didn't have enough iodine in the soil to have iodine present in plants and animals. It can also be found in bread and dairy products and plants grown in iodine-rich soil, as well as the animals that are fed iodine-rich plants. If you are deficient in iodine, this can result in enlargement of the thyroid gland, also known as goiter, which can lead to weight gain, mental and physical retardation of the infant, which is referred to cretinism. Now, while the term cretinism is slightly racist in nature, it is nevertheless a very serious condition and should be avoided. So if you have a small child, maybe don't feed them exclusively uniodized salt, even if you think that the government's out to get us by adding all these things to our food. It's just not true in this case. Toxicity of iodine can also lead to enlargement of the thyroid gland, and we call this iodine goiter. It can also depress thyroid activity. This is a picture of a goiter. It's generally highly visible. It's swelling and inflammation of the thyroid gland, which is in the neck, and leads to this very uncomfortable looking bulge. Now, the thyroid system is triggered in the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. There are some things called thyrotropin, which is a thyroid activating hormone, and thyroid stimulating hormone. This activates the thyroid gland, and there's a feedback loop between the pituitary and the hypothalamus and the thyroid gland. But the thyroid hormones are responsible for increasing your metabolism as well as stimulating your growth and development. And that last one you don't need to know about. This is an image lifted from Wikipedia, by the way. The article on the thyroid gland and the thyroid hormones on Wikipedia is quite informative, but pretty thick in biochemistry. So it's not for the faint of heart, I guess. I also got this picture from Wikipedia, and again, you aren't necessarily expected to memorize this figure, but it's helpful to sort of see the pathway by which iodine is utilized in thyroid cells to make thyroid hormones. So you have iodine ions coming in from the blood as well as sodium ions. They get popped in with a transport protein, and then they become involved in secretion of these large molecules, which then get combined in the actual thyroid gland into the thyroid hormones, thyroxine and triiodothyronine. The next mineral that's of relevance is manganese. And this is another metal that is even less commonly discussed. It's part of many enzymes which are involved in cell processes that are essential. We don't really have the biochemistry background in this class to go into exactly what those processes are, but it is necessary. The deficiency symptoms are notably noticed in experimental animals. These are poor growth, nervous system disorders, and reproductive abnormalities. And toxicity symptoms include nervous system disorders as well. Now, manganese is widely distributed in foods, and so you don't generally have to worry about getting enough of it. Soy has a specifically large amount of manganese, and as a result, people who consume a lot of soy can sometimes have issues getting too much manganese. Another metal is chromium, and this is one that gets a bad rap because in high quantities it's extremely toxic. However, it is involved in insulin production and is in fact required for the release of energy from glucose because it's involved in insulin sensing by your body. As a result, if you are deficient in chromium, you can experience diabetes-like condition, which is marked by an inability to use glucose normally. If you are toxic, there isn't really any known toxicity associated with nutritional disorders. However, occupational exposures from welding stainless steel, for instance, can severely damage your kidneys and also your skin. And you find chromium in meats as well as unrefined foods, unrefined fats, and vegetable oils. And there's this molecule that's being sold as a nutritional supplement in some places called chromium picolinate. Now, this is used because it can enhance insulin sensitivity and insulin production, which leads it to be an experimental treatment for type 2 diabetes, which, as you may remember, is characterized by insulin resistance. However, the tests in humans have had conflicting results, meaning that it's no guarantee that taking chromium picolinate will, in fact, improve your chromium status or your insulin sensitivity, and does come with it a danger of overdosing on chromium. And this is a nice little figure that kind of summarizes a number of the minerals that we've talked about so far and the foods you can get them from. This column is calcium, so spinach, broccoli, celery, mustard greens, avocados, and kale. You get magnesium from almonds, okra, flax seeds, dill, cocoa, and basil. You get iron from pumpkin seeds, kale, broccoli, quinoa, and spinach. You get potassium from coconut water, avocados, kiwi, Brussels sprouts, tomatoes, and figs. And you get manganese from cinnamon, garlic, thyme, chard, turmeric, and collard greens. Now, besides minerals, there are also other nutrients involved in blood health. So vitamin K we talked about in the context of bone mineralization. However, it is also a coenzyme involved in the synthesis of blood coagulating proteins, also known as platelets. If you consume too much vitamin K, besides some slight side effects that we mentioned in the bone health lecture, there really aren't any known side effects of consuming too much vitamin K, which is why oftentimes eating foods that are high in vitamin K won't do anything bad to you. If you don't get enough vitamin K, on the other hand, it can reduce your ability to form blood clots, which can lead to excessive bleeding. It can also lead to fat malabsorption, and this can be made worse by things like celiac disease, Crohn's disease, and cystic fibrosis. And long-term use of antibiotics can lead to a deficiency in vitamin K. As for this reason, vitamin K is often injected into newborn babies at birth. Vitamin K is produced in the gut by fermentation by microbes, but infants have no microbes in their gut because they've been relying on their mother's immune system. And oftentimes they can't get sufficient vitamin K from breast milk. So we inject them, and this ensures that they don't become vitamin K deficient immediately after birth. And this is a slight flow chart showing the activity of vitamin K. You don't need to memorize these names of proteins, but basically you have a precursor molecule that gets activated by vitamin A into something called prothrombin, which is itself an inactive protein, and then calcium and a phospholipid called thromboplastin from blood platelets gets added in, and this forms thrombin, which is an active enzyme. And then this other protein called fibrinogen, which is a type of protein that is soluble in water. It is activated by thrombin to make fibrin, which is the solid clot of blood that forms on a wound. And a chart showing the amount of vitamin K in various foods. Turnip greens and broccoli, Brussels sprouts, and spinach all have more than 100% of the recommended daily intake for men. And green leaf lettuce as well has more than 100% of the daily needs for women. Cabbage also has it. Soybean oil and canola oil have it. Another vitamin, vitamin B9 or folate, also known as folic acid, folacin, or pteroglutamic acid, or PGA. This is part of many coenzymes, including THF and DHF, which are used in DNA synthesis, which makes them essential for new cell formation. In addition, it can decrease the risk of neural tube defects in newborns and may lower blood levels of homocysteine, which is a collection of amino acids that is present in people with high blood triglycerides. You need about 400 micrograms per day of folate, and you shouldn't consume more than 1,000 milligrams because that can cause you to become toxic. Now, if you're deficient in folate, it can lead to something called macrocytic anemia, which is where your blood cells get too big and don't divide because you can't, since folate is essential for DNA synthesis, you can't undergo cell division if you can't do DNA synthesis. It can also cause heartburn, diarrhea, constipation, suppression of the immune system, frequent infections, smooth red tongue, depression, mental confusion, weakness, fainting, fatigue, insomnia, and irritability. If you get too much folate, it can mask B12 deficiency symptoms, which can in itself be a problem. And you get folate from green leafy vegetables, legumes, seeds, and liver, as well as fortified foods. The most absorbable form is folic acid from fortified foods, or supplement or synthetic folate supplements. In 1988, folic acid was added to the enrichment law for grains, which means that you can get roughly 10% of your RDA in one slice of bread. Natural folate in foods is bonded to a string of amino acids, specifically glutamine, which needs to be digested by enzymes in the liver, or in the intestine, I'm sorry. And there are some chemotherapy drugs that are folate antagonists, meaning that they interfere with the folate absorption and metabolism. Now, this is a picture of spina bifida, which is a neural tube defect characterized by folate deficiency. This is a picture of the spinal area of a newborn. You can see this bubble here. Now, this is a resultant from malformation of the spinal column. So in a normal vertebrae, you have the vertebral bones, and then you have the bones that surround the spinal cord. And there is something called the central chamber, which is closed in a normal vertebrae. But in someone with spina bifida, the two halves don't fuse together. And this allows nerve tissue to bulge out. And in the most severe form, that also leads to spinal cord moving out, and as well as spinal fluid. And this almost invariably leads to some level of paralysis, and as well as possible mental retardation. And this is a picture of the different types of folate. So folate, as it's enriched into our food, has this structure. It's the full structure isn't really important, but the point is that you have this ring structure bonded to glutamate, which is the dissolved form of glutamic acid, which is a amino acid. And in naturally occurring folate, there are a number of glutamine molecules bonded to this ring structure, and digestion in the intestine breaks those glutamates off and forms the active form of folate, or rather the inactive form of folate, which is activated by vitamin B12, which itself activates from grabbing this group. And then you have active folate and active B12, and those can now participate in DNA synthesis. Now, there is a case for taking supplemental folate because it's more bioavailable, and if you have problems getting enough folate, then that could be the solution. However, if you're getting it in your foods, it sort of makes sense that we want to be getting more amino acids, because typically Glutamine is an essential amino acid, meaning that your body can both utilize it directly or synthesize it into other non-essential amino acids. And here are some foods that have folate in them. So you see avocados, orange juice, a number of legumes in the front, broccoli, spinach, and asparagus. And this is a very big table. It might be more easy to dig through it in the PowerPoint presentation that will be posted. But you can see here the ones highlighted in yellow are very good sources of folate, like spinach and broccoli. Tomato juice also has a lot. And you can see the legumes listed down here. Now this brings us to vitamin B12, also known as cobalamin, because it contains cobalt. It has a couple of different forms, and it's part of coenzymes that are used for the synthesis of new cells, as well as the maintenance of nerve cells, the reformation of folate coenzyme, and also helps to break down fatty acids and amino acids. You need 2.4 micrograms of it a day, and it has previously been known as extrinsic factor, which is why the compound in your stomach that activates B12 is called intrinsic factor. And it was first isolated in 1948. If you have a B12 deficiency, it leads to something called pernicious anemia, which is the inability of your cells to divide, and therefore leads to the lack of new cell formation. Now, if you are not chronically deficient, but just sort of deficient, it can lead to macrocytic anemia, which is large blood cells again. It can lead to smooth tongue, fatigue, degeneration of peripheral nerves, which can progress to paralysis and hypersensitivity. And the thing about B12 is that it's nearly impossible to get enough of it without consuming some type of animal product. However, there's some evidence that B12 can be added. It can be fermented into foods in order to avoid the need to consume animal products. This is a picture of the vitamin B12 molecule. You don't need to know the structure again, but I'm showing it so that you can see that it is a giant molecule that basically surrounds the cobalt atom and makes it available to your body. This is a picture showing sources of B12. Notice most of them are animal products. Now, another thing that's essential for proper blood health is water. Now, I mention water again because there's some interesting general information that you can have about water. 75% of Americans are chronically dehydrated, and about 37% of Americans are so dehydrated they think that they're hungry instead of being thirsty. Now, I mentioned in the water lecture that even mild dehydration can slow your metabolism down as much as 3%. But one glass of water can shut down your midnight hunger for almost 100% of dieters. So it's something I've personally experienced when trying to maintain my weight. If I drink water when I feel hungry, I almost always don't feel hungry afterward. Dehydration and lack of water is the number one trigger of daytime fatigue, and preliminary research indicates that 8 to 10 glasses of water is sufficient to ease back and joint pain in 80% of people that suffer from it. And I mentioned before, a mere 2% drop in body water can trigger things like fuzzy short-term memory, trouble with basic math, and difficulty focusing on screens and printed pages. Now, there's often a discussion about what is better to consume, bottled water versus tap water. A couple of statistics. On average, bottled water consumes 2,000 times more energy than tap water in its production. At the same time, about 30 million plastic bottles end up in landfills or the ocean every day. This is now in the United States, we only recycle about 5% of our plastic water bottles, largely because recycling companies claim that it's not profitable to recycle plastic. However, I don't remember anybody asking them because we just need to do it. So anybody who tells you recycling isn't profitable, ask them why they need to profit. Simple as that. The other thing, municipal tap water is tested more often and held to higher safety standards than bottled water. It's interesting. Something that is publicly owned is better than something privately owned. Who would have thought? 1 liter of bottled water requires 3 liters of water to produce and generally costs 10,000 times more than tap water, which is more by volume than gasoline or soda. Now, there are different types of water that might be marketed. Distilled water is really only useful for using in some kind of processing and not really for consumption. It's good to put in your iron because it doesn't leave mineral deposits. Spring water is often marketed as being somehow better than other water. However, there are no regulations on the location of the spring, and groundwater is severely contaminated in the United States due to rampant pollution. So there's really no guarantee that spring water is any better than any other water. In fact, it might sometimes be worse. Bottled spring water, too, since it's not held to the same safety regulations as tap water, is often incredibly high in microbes and can actually deplete your immune system. Vitamin water is just one variation of a sports drink. They have vitamins and minerals and electrolytes in them, but also lots of sugar, which really means that they're not necessary for anybody to consume unless you are an athlete who is regularly depleting themselves of sugar and electrolytes. Now, there's also coconut water, which has a lot of claims about it. The biggest claim is that it's a naturally occurring electrolyte beverage. It has a lot of potassium, and specifically more potassium than sodium, as well as magnesium, which means that it is a good electrolyte water to consume after heavy physical activity or a long night of drinking. Other things you can do to get enough water, and also other nutrients, is consume water-heavy foods like cucumbers or melons. And this can often be a better way because they also contain B vitamins naturally. And if you remember, B vitamins are essential for energy metabolism and blood health and synthesis. Now, there are a lot of energy drinks on the market that make claims about how much energy they can give you and how little of a crash that they might have, like 5-hour energies. In general, an energy drink is just an unregulated, sugary, caffeinated beverage that has other legal stimulants in it, like guarana and ginseng, and enormous amounts of caffeine. Now, some of these beverages don't have sugar in them, instead just have copious amounts of artificial sweeteners, which we discussed a little bit in our sugar lecture, aren't necessarily better for you. Red Bull also contains taurine and glucuronolactone, which has been recently removed because it's bad for you. It usually has a lot of B vitamins. They also have about the same amount of caffeine as a cup of coffee, which leads us to the idea of that you could just drink coffee instead, because coffee isn't a bastardized lab chemical emulsion. It is actually kind of full of minerals and can actually help stimulate your metabolism. The magnesium and chromium in it can help prevent type 2 diabetes because it helps with insulin. Coffee contains antioxidants. It has been shown to help with Parkinson's disease, as well as helping relieve gallstones, and can help reduce heart arrhythmia and stroke. Coffee is a diuretic, but it doesn't dehydrate you. And you can, if you drink 1 cup a day, it's generally considered healthy unless you're pregnant, which when you shouldn't consume any coffee at all. It can lower your risk for skin, breast, and uterine cancer as well. Now, tea, on the other hand, contains polyphenols that work as antioxidants just like coffee, but it has less caffeine, but similar heart and cancer benefits. Tea also contains fluoride and tannins, which can help prevent plaque buildup and has no calories, whereas coffee does have calories because it has fat in it. It can also increase your metabolism. So now we're going to move on to talk about the immune system briefly. We have concluded our discussion of the micronutrients for the most part. There are a couple listed in this section. So a healthy immune system is what protects our body from infectious disease, helps us heal our wounds, and guards against the development of cancers. And there are two ways that our immune system functions. There is something called the nonspecific immune system, which is also known as the innate immune system. And then there's our specific immune system, which is when we adapt to getting viruses and bacterial infections, and we flag our white blood cells in order to specifically target those illnesses. The first line of defense against infection is the nonspecific immune system. It's referred to as innate immunity, and in addition to it protecting us against microbes, it also protects us against airborne toxins, venom, and ingested toxins. The first aspect of the nonspecific immune system is intact skin and healthy mucous membranes. Mucous membranes being things like your mouth, nose, and genitals. The stomach acid in our stomach generally destroys foodborne bacteria. So if you have low acid in your stomach, you can be vulnerable in that regard. And then we have something called the inflammatory response, which generally causes discomfort, loss of appetite, fatigue, and fever, which are all signs that your body is attempting to fight an infection. Now, one of the types of nonspecific immune cells that are fairly prominent and talked about a lot are macrophages. These are literal globules of white blood cells that go around engulfing invading microbes and just breaking them down. Obviously, this can only help so much. If you have an overpopulation of a bacteria or microbe, then it will overwhelm the macrophages and make them ineffective in preventing the infection, which is where our specific immune system comes in. So when we get an illness, it takes our body a little while to react to it, but then once it has reacted to it, it can have a memory of that interaction. So whenever it encounters an antigen, it can produce antibodies and memory cells, which destroy the invader and tag our white blood cells to continue to attack further invasion by that specific antigen. And this is done with the interaction of B cells, which produce antibodies that kill invaders and also flag invaders for destruction by T cells, which attack the antigens directly. So antibodies are chemicals secreted by B cells that kill microbes, and these can be something like an antibiotic compound. T cells themselves go right after them and consume them and break them down directly. You acquire specific immunity first and foremost by having diseases. So when you have a disease, your body develops an immunity to them, assuming that you have a good nutritional status. Some diseases get around this immune function, and this is what makes them especially dangerous. Things like HIV. Vaccinations can also help stimulate our acquired immunity. We also refer to these as immunizations. Another thing that can help develop our specific immunity is maternal antibodies delivered to an infant via breast milk, or something like an anti-serum injection, which you would get to treat a snake bite. Now, if we have a malfunction in our immune system, it can lead to chronic inflammation and infection, which can lead to large amounts of allergic reactions, autoimmune responses, which you find commonly in malnourished people, as well as people with immune deficiency diseases. So a nourishing diet in principle, if you follow all the guidelines found in this class, you should be able to get all of the nutrients required for a properly functioning immune system. Now, something called single nutrient subclinical deficiencies, which is when you have one nutrient that is severely deficient in your body while the rest of them are normal. This can cause subtle abnormalities in immunity that might not be immediately noticeable. Another thing that can severely deplete your immune system is protein energy malnutrition because of all the enzymes that are required for proper immune function, as well as any severe micronutrient deficiency. The protein energy malnutrition increases the risk for infection, and infection depresses the appetite, which often causes vomiting and diarrhea, which in turn cause malnutrition, which increases your vulnerability to infection. So it's kind of really a bad negative feedback loop. But also, the presence of this effect in your body, we call this decreased immunocompetence. This is a sensitive indicator of reduced nutritional status and one of the key markers for starvation. Another major risk factor for lowered immunity is obesity, because obesity causes the inflammatory response in our body, which increases our incidence of infections. It delays wound healing. It leads to poor antibody response to vaccinations. And this inflammatory state may increase asthma, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes. One of the ways that you can help mitigate the inflammatory response and improve your immune system is by consuming essential fatty acids, because they're precursors for signaling molecules called eicosanoids that are involved in immune response. Things like EPA and DHA will reduce inflammation and can possibly treat chronic inflammatory conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, and cardiovascular disease. Likewise, vitamins and minerals can play an important role in immunity. So vitamin A helps maintain mucosal surfaces, which are the first line of defense against invasion by microbes. Vitamin C and E protect our cell membranes from reactive oxygen species, which lowers the amount of inflammation present. Zinc is very important for immune function because it's important for gene expression and enzyme activation, as well as B and T cell proliferation. Selenium is important. As mentioned before, it's part of the antioxidant system called glutathione peroxidase. It also helps promote B and T cell proliferation, as well as antibody production. Iron and copper are part of superoxide catalase and dismutase, which is how your body gets rid of reactive oxygen species. It's also associated with deficiencies in immune response and B and T cell function. And excessive iron can also impair immunity. And when you have an infection, this alters your nutrient status, so it reduces your food intake, because illness infection generally reduces your appetite and overall intake while increasing nutrient loss and increasing your metabolic rate because your body temperature is higher, which leads to a higher rate of calorie consumption. So if you redistribute your energy and nutrient consumption, you can enhance your immune response while you're sick. This obviously is of paramount importance right now in our society. Everybody wants to be taking all the steps that they can possibly take to protect themselves from becoming ill, especially in this trying time. So this concludes our micronutrient discussions. I know it's probably been a wild ride and there's been a lot of information to internalize, but at this point we're going to be talking mostly about applications of all this information, so you'll have an opportunity to review for about 3 weeks before you have to do the final. So anyway, hope everybody has a good Thanksgiving, and we'll talk to you next week.